Hey there, Daryl Burling here from Master New Testament Greek, and welcome to this very special live stream. I've really been looking forward to this conversation with Kevin Grasso. Now, a few weeks ago, you may remember I did a number of videos talking about, a couple of videos with Rob Plummer talking about the grammar translate method. And part of the reason that I wanted to do that video was because I've been listening to the podcasts that the Biblingo guys and Kevin and have been putting out over the last few months, I guess, and it sort of prompted a number of things in me that I wanted to sort of address as well. And then after those videos, Kevin was good enough to reach out and we got into a conversation and we got on a live call together and talked and felt that, wouldn't it be great just to do a live stream together where we can sort of talk, get together, talk about what we have in common, what we have different, and just how we want to serve people like you and really how we want to serve the church. So we wanted to get together on this call to do exactly that. So I'm glad you're here with us. What we're going to do today, I'm going to bring on Kevin in just a moment. And what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce introduce him and talk about a few different questions that we've been talking about behind the scenes. And then what I want to do is open it up for you so that if you have questions about learning Greek or anything like that, then this is a great opportunity for you to ask those questions and we can work through answering them together. Now, I don't know how long this is going to take. I've kind of put aside an hour for it. If it goes a little longer than that, I'd probably prefer not to. It might go a little less than that. I don't know. I guess if you're watching this afterwards, you already know how long it is. So let's get into it and let me bring on Dr. Kevin Grasso. Kevin, welcome to welcome. Thank you and welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Great. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Anytime. So let's start, Kevin. Let's start with a little bit about you and Biblingo to start with. Just sort of tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, a bit about your background, and then we'll get into some of the more, I don't know about product-oriented questions, but questions related to what we do and why we do it.
The fun stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm from Atlanta, Georgia originally, so grew up here. I'm here now. I just spent the past 5 years in Israel getting my PhD in Hebrew, and basically while I was there was studying mostly linguistics. I also did another master's in comparative religion. So trying to, kind of my background is to try to bring linguistics to bear on both, language acquisition in the biblical languages field, right, and also biblical exegesis. So that's kind of the heartbeat of what I do.
And that's awesome. So that just right up the front, that sort of starts off with, there's a key difference between you and I there, right? You have started with a linguistics background. So tell us a little about why linguistics. Why was that your starting point?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, kind of like historically in my own life, I realized pretty early on, actually, that I've always been very interested in theology, and I've always felt that, the sorts of like theological discussions that people have make a real impact on people and their lives and how they live. And so for me, I said to myself, okay, so if I'm going to, speak intelligently about God's word, I have to know the original languages, right? Because I saw that a lot of the big discussions within biblical studies and theology were actually discussions when it came down to it about what a certain Greek word or phrase or syntactic construction meant, right, or Hebrew. And so I said to myself, well, I need to know these languages, and then I also took a step further back, right, and I said, well, I actually first need a theory of language. Right, I need to figure out how language works, how syntax works, how semantics works, and then I need to go to the biblical languages and apply that. So that's kind of what led me to go, more into linguistics than most people would otherwise, because I felt like I really need a theory of meaning and syntax in order to speak intelligently about the kinds of discussions that people have about Greek and Hebrew linguistics.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so really, you sort of, I guess what you're sort of saying there, you can correct me if I sort of mistaken this, but you're sort of saying that really in order to understand what the Bible's saying in the original languages, you wanted to have, like, it's not just a matter of or what does the text say, there's actually, there's more to it than just that, right? Determining meaning is deeper than just the actual word on a page. Do you want to unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think an example is helpful here. So I mean, one of the things that people kind of know me for now is like the Pistis Christou debate, right? And so I published an article on that. Was interviewed with OnScript and Matthew Bates on it, and basically my point is that I think this is a solvable linguistic problem, right? I don't think it is a theological issue. It's not whether you believe in Christ's priority or man's priority. Like that's not the issue. Like the issue at the end of the day is like, what does this specific phrase what's the range of meaning in Greek, and what does the context, how does the context constrain that meaning? And so I do a deep dive into deverbal nouns and a bunch of linguistic stuff, and come to the conclusion that basically a third view is correct and subjective or genitive. But all of that to say, it's an example of how I think you can use linguistics, and if you have the right tools, you see the text differently, right? Because for a long time in that debate, for example, people will go back and forth using the same tools, right? And what I'm trying to do, and what I have tried to do through my studies, is to say, okay, let's try to take new tools, right, that have been developed in syntax and semantics, people that don't care about the Bible, they just want to know how language works, right? And let's see if we can find something in the text that those theories help us to illuminate and to think more clearly about. And I think you can disagree or agree with me on the Pistis Christou debate, but I think that's an example of how I've tried to do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know you'd written that article, so listening to you talking about that, I'd be really interested in reading your article on it. One of the questions I wanted to know, though, is just sort of, as you get up in the morning, when you think of, you started Biblingo, what, 2012, 13, somewhere around there, is that right?
So the idea came into my head in more like 15, but we really started, and we launched publicly about a year ago. So, okay. But it was 2018 that we became a company, but a year ago was the really product launch.
Right, cool. And what drives you? What made you decide that you wanted to start an organization which teaches people Greek? Tell us about what's behind that.
Yeah, well, first of all, it is Hebrew too, and that's my PhD, so I have to throw that in there. But
true.
But so yeah, I think at the end of the day, what sort of drives me and really the whole Biblingo team is creating resources, to help people learn the languages with the ultimate goal of them being able to know the word better, and through knowing the word better, to love God more. I mean, that's really what we're all about. Originally, I was doing my MA in linguistics for Bible translation, and was kind of shocked that we didn't have a tool like this, that you could teach Hebrew and Greek using modern language learning methods. And so I said this just has to happen, right? For the sake of translators all over the world that don't speak English, and there's no way for them to learn the languages, right, if they don't first go through English or have another language where there's a grammar in it. So for me, it really has always been how can we develop a product that is useful for the global church. And I mean, it's really exciting and humbling. Now we're on every continent except Antarctica, and I get emails all the time from pastors and teachers and translators all over the world, which is just really humbling to see, God doing something through Biblingo.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we started this conversation really is that through Master New Testament Greek, I'm using books like Rob Plummer's Beginning with New Testament Greek and other grammars, and really the approach that I'm using is consistent with that very approach. Now, that's not the way you guys do it, though. Talk to us about how you approach language acquisition?
Yeah. So good question. So, I think in to reference the pod or the shows that you guys did, right? It was kind of the grammar translation method versus I think you call it the natural language method, right? So the terms don't really matter, right?
Correct.
But you can just stick with that term, right? The natural language method. So, for us, we think that the best way to acquire language is to use language in a meaningful way, right? So at the end of the day, what it means to know Spanish is being able to communicate meaningfully in Spanish, and that does not mean just speaking. It doesn't mean just listening. It's also writing or reading, right? Communication can be, those are the four forms of communication: reading, writing, speaking, listening. And so the point would be that in order to learn the language, I mean, what it even means to learn a language is to learn how to use it meaningfully. So that's where, for us, that's where we're driving all the time in everything we do. That being said, Greek and Hebrew are unique in the sense that there is a long grammatical tradition, and the grammar is also very important, right? It's very important in the sense that, like, most people, when they learn a second language, they're not tearing apart the grammar, right? They're not looking at a specific sentence, again, like the business Christian debate, like they're not looking at one particular phrase and writing hundreds of pages on why it means a certain thing, right? So they don't need to learn as much about the grammar. But we think, that's not the case, right? With Hebrew and Greek, like you do need to learn grammar. And so we have incorporated, videos as well of me explaining the grammatical concepts using, some of the linguistic tools that I have learned in my own study of linguistics proper.
That's great. So, so let me just ask this then. This might be a little bit... would you say that a pastor who can read through the New Testament in Greek but can't speak it or write it, does he know the language?
Absolutely. So as long as we define carefully what it means to read, right? And so this is something that, like, it might seem obvious, but many seminaries or classes teach, they say that their goal is reading, right? But in reality, there's very little reading that's done in the class, right? Yeah. There's a lot of glossing of sentences, but if you can sit down and read the Greek New Testament like it's the English New Testament, then you are absolutely, you are a fluent reader in that language, right? So if you are a fluent reader, you don't have to be a fluent speaker, right? It's if you are a fluent speaker and you can read, you are most likely a fluent reader as well, right? And so, and this is one of the things that we kind of discussed, and you guys discussed, right? You and Rob, is what is the fastest way to get someone to that point, right? Which is a different question, right? Than the sort of baseline level question of, like, do they know the language if they can read the text? Absolutely, right? Then there's the question of, like, how do we best get them there?
Yeah, which is great. And I think, there's a couple of things just sort of, in there with regards to, to just draw a little bit more. One of them is, with the approach that you guys have, one of the questions that some of my students have asked is, how long does it take for somebody using the Biblingo or the natural language approach or communicative approach, whatever you want to call it, how long does it take for them to get into the New Testament texts, and before they're actually able to sort of work with texts in the New Testament?
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question. I mean, I think again, it kind of depends on how you define, like, work with text in the New Testament, right? Because in theory, I can go to someone, and some people teach Greek in this way, right? They just say, let's start at John 1:1, right? And they say, here's this word, and they gloss it, right? Here's the next word, they gloss it, right? And so you can learn Greek in that way, right? The question is, is that the most efficient way, right? And I would say no. And so you can get into the text, whenever. For us, what we we are operating under second language acquisition principles that we've done research on, and we've said, okay, like, what is the fastest way to get people to reading proficiency? So there have been studies done that say you should really know 98% of the words in a text, right? That's kind of your in order to read a text, like really read the text in a meaningful way, you if you don't know that many words, you're going to struggle to be reading the text. It then becomes more like glossing, right? You're going back and forth with a translation. And so for us, the question is, like, how do we get people to the point where they can do that with the New Testament, right? And so we have designed, like, reading comprehension drills that are always at the student's level, right? And so we're going to defer getting into the New Testament until they can read it until it's at their level, right? And so what we've done, right, is we've taken Greek and Hebrew texts, and we've written them in a way that is very, very easy, right? And then it gets progressively harder, and as you go through the program, you see more and more real verses, real stories, right? Or first you see simplified biblical stories, and then you see real texts, and for us, so it's more of a question of when and kind of the on ramp of how do we prepare students to enter the text in a meaningful way? Because for us, and for I think probably for all of your users and all of our users, what they want is they want to be able to sit down with the Greek New Testament and read the thing like it's a book, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you can't just do that, right? And so we try to, as far as reading goes, we try to take gradual steps to help them get there.
Yeah. So I think that is one of the key differences, I think, and I think that I'm not sure here's one of the things as I'm sort of thinking about this. I'm not sure how much it matters to the average person about what how we would define reading in a sense, because for them it's kind of like, I just want to get into the original languages to be able to start to see the meaning for myself and that kind of thing. And so I think there's one of the things that we can run into dangers with, and and I think honestly the grammar translate versus communicative approach debate falls into this bucket. Really, it's kind of one of these academic discussions in some ways that is, not to say it has no value, it has value, but it's one of those things that's not, the average person is not really thinking about it. It's not kind of the sort of thing that really is useful to them. What they're really interested in is just getting into the text and sort of starting to grapple with the material that's there, which leads then to the question of that deeper study, that exegetical work. How does the communicative approach, and maybe you can speak to this not just for the Biblingo approach, but for other approaches as well, how does the communicative approach work with exegesis? Now, you mentioned you do some grammar, but just sort of unpack that for us as well, because a lot of people who are going through and learning Greek, part of the reason to do that is to study the New Testament, right? Which is where exegesis comes in. So talk to us about that as well.
Yeah, so I think in this area, like you really should separate, on a spectrum of like pure grammar translation to more communicative approaches. Like we've tried to position ourselves more in the middle, right? And so there are some communicative people that say, you should not be taught any explicit grammar, right? So the grammar that you learn is just going to be internalized through language use, right? And so when I am speaking in English, I am not thinking about the particular uses of the definite article. I'm just not doing that, right? I know how to use the definite article. In linguistics, people have spent their careers trying to figure out what the word the really means, right? So to analyze the word is much harder than to actually figure out how to use the word, right? Um, so that being said, for us, right, we have tried to position ourselves in the middle, and we do introduce grammatical concepts. So what we want to say is, okay, we will introduce the grammatical term to you, how you're going to see it in a commentary, right? And make it accessible to where, when you go to another textbook, you know what they're talking about, right? But then in order to internalize that, we say the only way you're going to internalize that really is through use, right? So you need to use it meaningfully in the correct way. And if you don't, like you're not gonna, it's not gonna sink in. So that is where we would fall on the communicative. We'd say if you, the grammar, you have to use it meaningfully. And so for exegesis, right, when we then come to how does all this affect the way that we actually read the text and understand it in the original, right? I think I personally think you do need both. So I think one problem with doing only grammar translation, right, is that you often have people basically reading the English through Greek or Hebrew, right? And so they know the English well, and they say, okay, this is just like English. And I see this all the time in commentaries where they'll say, oh, this is they'll make claims about like the definite article in Greek, even though the definite article in Greek works very, very differently than the definite article in English, right? And so they will be reading the Greek New Testament through an English lens. And I think when I see this happen, right, I think part of it is because the way that the grammar translation method is taught sometimes is to just gloss, right? So you're glossing each word. Oh, ho, to, that's the, and you gloss, right? So, but that's not really true, right? And so what communicative helps you with in this respect, right, is to say, okay, well, how, like, in what kinds of context would we actually use the definite article, and what kinds of context would we not, right? And so then it's when we're thinking about, the kinds of, right, that's actually a different question, right? And then when we see, the definite article used in a certain context, we can say, oh, okay, this is how they're using it in that context, and you can internalize it and begin to intuit the grammar, even in a way that you could not otherwise if you just did the grammar translation method. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I totally get that, and I think that there's again knowing the grammar. Here's my thing: knowing the grammar, I think, is critical if you're going to do exegesis, because even if you internalize the grammar, you still have to be able to follow what's going on in a commentary or a journal article or whatever it is that you're working with. Otherwise, you can't actually build arguments, create logic, or anything like that. You're just not even in the same kind of arena for discussion. And I think one of the challenges is that some communicative approaches and some of the conversations I've heard and people who have sort of commented on some of the things that I've put out on Master New Testament Greek or whatever, YouTube, social media, whatever. You get the odd person who's like, this whole approach is just not really the way language works, and therefore we shouldn't really do it this way at all. But let me just pause for just a moment, because I think there's another thing I want to come back to. But before I do that, I just want to mention, for those of you who are watching this live, I just want to encourage you, if you've got a question for us you want to answer, just put them into that chat box there, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. And if you're getting value from this, hit the like button. That really helps us out and make sure other people find this as well. And even if it's just thankful for Kevin spending this time with me today, I'd love to just give him a thumbs up for that as well. So thank you. So Kevin, one thing I just wanted to comment on that I think you've hit a good note on, and I totally agree with you on this, is going back to really the way Greek is taught, and Hebrew for that matter, I think, in seminaries. Now, I think there are some issues with curriculums and, accreditation systems and semester terms and all those kinds of things, not to mention that in, say, an MDiv program, which is where these things are often taught, there's often just only a handful of classes allocated for languages. And I think all of these things mean that professors have to just reduce down their expectation and hopes for what you can actually achieve in the language in the time that you're actually in university. And for those of you like you and I think this is a huge opportunity for us because we don't have those constraints. We have the freedom to say, what do we want language acquisition to look like at the end of the time people spend with us? And how do we bring that about? And I think that's one of the key differences there as well. And I think on the grammar translate approach, a lot of professors and seminaries, for that reason, will spend a lot of time doing exegesis and zero time doing reading. And I think this is the connection that you and I have, is that we want people to be reading the text. And I think there's a difference there in terms of how that looks. I'm going to have people in the New Testament pretty quickly, glossing, as you would say, perhaps, but at least sort of understanding how the words fit together, the constructions, why they look the way they look, why they, how this, the article works with this genitive infinite, this genitive article works with this infinitive, or whatever it happens to be, and how we translate that and why that's significant, or if it's significant, the aorist, for instance, and things like that. So those are the kinds of things we're going to be doing. And for you, you're just going to be getting them in, reading the text, and giving them a different set of skills, similar, complementary. And I think, but I think that there's these, I guess in some ways, there's, for both of us, there's people on the outsides of us who would be grammar translate only, exegesis only, no translation, and no reading. And on the far side, it's reading, no grammar, and nothing else in the middle. And I think this is that kind of spot in the middle where you and I meet, where these things are important. We have different approaches, but at the same time, we're still trying to get people into the text richer and deeper. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I can't speak, to your program, so I can't, I can't say how close we are. I will say, just in general, I do think that communicative people know grammar, right? Because they've almost always come from grammar translation first, right? And so I personally have never met anyone that can speak Greek and doesn't know what a genitive is, right? Okay. Usually, if they can speak Greek, they've already done years of the grammar translation method, and they're usually pretty good at it. So I think right now part of the issue, and I think this is why we're having this discussion is the question is what place does the living language communicative stuff have at all, right? And that's
and vice versa with the grammar translate as well. What place is that?
Right.
Yeah.
For sure, because I think there's been a reaction, right? And the reaction has been, okay, that didn't work. Let's just teach people how to use the language, right? And so that reaction has fed into these classrooms. At the end of the day, like I said, I've been in communicative classes, where all you do is speak in Greek, but it's just it's not the case that they don't know grammar, right? And so the issue though, right, is how do we I mean, again, I think it does go back to this. How do we get students from point A to point B, and point B being reading the text with understanding and proficiency, and I think that's where the communicative guys, like most of those people, did the grammar translation method and then said that didn't work for me for whatever reason, right? And then they looked for something else, and then they found this and they said, oh, when I learn to speak it, it actually helps my reading, right? And I've heard this story, time and time again. I've never heard the story of someone who's tried to make their knowledge active, to make their knowledge to where you can use it, and they regretted it, right? I've never heard that story. I do hear the story all the time of, I took seminary. It was 5 years ago. I don't remember anything, right? Yeah. And I think the issue with that is that they actually did not, and seminary programs are different, but there are plenty of them where they're not acquiring the language, right? And when you acquire a language, I mean, it's a skill. So like if, as an example, I, play basketball, right? A lot. I've played basketball a lot. I play the violin in a very mediocre way, right? But when I go back to the basketball court, after months of not being there, it's like riding a bike. It's like I've got this. I mean, I'm a little rusty, but I'm there, right? I'm about the same skill level. When I go back to the violin, it still sounds not very good, right? Because I haven't developed that skill. So the issue is that with language learning, that's how it should be, right? There shouldn't be such a thing as like, oh, I took Greek for a year, I don't remember any of it, right? That just if you're acquiring the language, you should remember the skill that you developed, right? But because people aren't acquiring the language in that way, they end up with almost nothing, right? Yeah. Because if all you're learning is genitive, right, then you end up, just forgetting the terms, and then you don't have access to the text.
Totally. And I agree with you. I think, and I've talked about this on other YouTube videos in the past, that we can't think about learning Greek as like just a class like history or something like that, where you've sort of done it and now you kind of got an overview of how it works and that's going to equip you for the future. It's a skill. You develop it like a skill. And I think your analogy of playing the violin is a great one. People go through a seminary class, they'll learn Greek, they'll do Greek exegesis, but they have still got no skill reading the text, no skill actually with the language. Sure, you can compartmentalize and categorize and all that kind of stuff and write about the significance of this particular category or whatever, but that doesn't mean you've got any skill with the language per se. So I totally agree with you, and and that, again, that's one of the things that we try to do in Master New Testament Greek as well. We do have a couple of questions coming in. Actually, there's a couple of people in the comments, which is really cool actually, who use both Biblingo and Master New Testament Greek. How cool is that? And who is saying this is a great and a good effective combination to have. So, for instance, what do we got here? Here's Jordan. I use Biblingo and Master New Testament Greek and find the combination to be very effective. I then fill in the gaps with grammar. Joey says the same thing. He agrees the combination is very effective. So, there's a number of comments like that coming in, which is really gratifying, I think, and it's nice to sort of see. So maybe we're on the right track here, talking together about this. Okay, cool. Let me just come to a couple of these questions. This will spark some other conversations, I'm sure. This is a good one, I think, for both you and I to both answer, and there's a couple of questions like this that have come up in here. What are the best resources to learn Koine Greek? How many hours should one dedicate a day to master Greek? So, Kevin, go ahead and you give an answer first. Give us an idea what it looks like. This is a great comparative sort of this question, I think. So, what are your thoughts from a Biblingo point of view?
Yeah, so if you ask me what the best resource is, like, I have to say, like, there isn't. We are the only software dedicated to the biblical languages in this way, right? And if you want to practice the language, just like, and practicing the language is like practicing, basketball or the violin. Like that's how you get good. I think we have tried to design it to where, you have as much practice as you want, right? And we're continuing to build out exercises to where that's more so the case. As far as so resources, what was the other part of that question?
What are the best? How many hours should one dedicate in a day to master?
How many hours? So here's the deal, right? Again, if you think about it like a skill, the question is just how good do you want to be, right? It's not like people ask me all the time. So I lived in Israel for 5 years. People ask me, oh, are you fluent? Well, I took classes in Hebrew, right? Like I can have a conversation in Hebrew. But when you learn a second language, you realize like this whole fluency thing is a weird thing, right? Because if you catch me, in a certain environment where I don't know any of the vocabulary, in a doctor's office in Hebrew, right? I have no idea, right? And so the question is, how long does it take you to master Greek? What I would suggest is you should think about it differently. You should think, how can I work in consistent practice into my schedule, and how many consistent sessions of 30 minutes can I work in, right? And so it's a different way of framing it. And just to say, like, I was in Israel. I that's where I learned to speak Greek and Hebrew, right? And I learned a lot in a very short amount of time. I still, have to practice every day, right? That's just how you get good at these things. And so what I would say is, it's not the most helpful question. But that being said, if you consistently practice, like we've designed our program, for example, to be done, we have 52 lessons. We got 33 out in Greek right now. We'll have 52. It's designed to be done in a year. You should be able to, at the end of a year, like if you practice, let's say 20 minutes a day at the end of the year, you should be able to sit down and read the New Testament, like especially the easy stuff, without a dictionary, right? And you should be able to be basically reading it about as fast as you would in English. And so that's the goal, right? I think you, and that's if you are very consistent, right? And again, that would still be easy material, right? John is easy material. But I still think that the question really is like, how can I work out this? How can I work in this consistent practice into my schedule?
Yeah. That's a great question. So great answer. So from my point of view, what I typically say to somebody when they ask this question, how many hours a day or how much time per day, I don't know what people think, because I used to think that, it had to be like 8 hours a day, and that's how much time I'd have to spend learning the language, and there's no hope for me ever to do that. Hence, we have to be immersed in the culture. Blah, blah, blah. I knew nothing. I knew absolutely nothing at that stage. Now what I typically say to people is, if you've got the right disciplines in place, you can spend, it depends from one person to another. Some people learn faster than other people. And again, I'm not teaching active knowledge of the language, just passive knowledge of the language. So I'm giving you certain exercises, and I would say normally, but for most people, it's somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes. Some people it takes more than that. Some people, it depends on the grammar as well. Like from a grammar translate point of view, some grammars like this one, Rob Plummer and Ben Merkel's grammar, is much less work from my experience so far anyway, compared to something like Mount. So there's a lot more, people get hung up in details on Mounts, they just don't need to know so much. So for the most part, I would say 30 to 60 minutes should fit most people if you're doing the right exercise and if you're consistent in that. And I would say 5 days a week, maybe 7 if you can do more, but that would be my kind of ballpark sort of number. And using the grammar translate method, you're going to be in the New Testament pretty much from the second or third lesson once you've gotten through the alphabet. So that's an interesting question, and I think there's some different answers, I guess, there for you, Avis. I hope that helps. Daniel has another one here that's kind of similar, and we've already sort of answered some of this, but I think the question here really that I want to address is really with regards to exegesis. So Daniel says, both of you stress reading with different approaches. How important is exegesis in addition to merely reading? And there's a follow-up question, must it always come after reading? So I think we've kind of talked about the stressing reading piece a little bit, in the sense that we've talked about that with grammar translate and so on. How important is exegesis? Are you comfortable with the answer you gave earlier on for that, Kevin? Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just caution, it really does depend on how you define reading and exegesis here, right? I mean, at the end of the day, to use more neutral terms, everyone wants to understand the text better, right? That's what they want to be able to do.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, when you're reading, reading is not analyzing. So reading is, sitting down and working through a text, not stopping at the grammar. Like when you see a genitive when you're reading, you're not stopping, right? You're not trying to figure out what kind of genitive it is. That's not reading. Reading is going through the text, right? And so that being said, right, exegesis, the way most people talk about that is stopping, right? Analyzing, trying to figure out what kind of genitive this is, right? And so they're different skills. You do, if you are going to describe the grammar, right, you have to have categories for that, right? And that's where you do need to know something about what the kinds of things that you would learn in a grammar translation class, right? Or that again, we have short videos for this at the beginning of each lesson. Like that's the kind of thing you would need to know to analyze. But yeah, so I think it people often confuse these terms, and they they think reading is one thing, or exegesis is one thing, but that would be my definition. I mean, hopefully that provides some clarity.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think exegesis, you can do exegesis without reading, but I think your exegesis will suffer for it. That's my kind of response to this, because you're going to end up working with these categories. And I have one student from very early on. He went through seminary. He learned how to do exegesis. He did that for 20 years, doing sermon preparation and so on. He then got a hold of Master New Testament Greek, the student edition, the vocabulary only, started learning the vocabulary, and then started reading the text, using the approach that I recommend there and which we still use today. And he was like, now I'm finally reading. After 20 years, I'm no longer picking my way through the language, which is exactly what you do in exegesis. Now, there's a place for that. But the thing is that if all you're doing is exegesis, you run the risk of using those categories to override the author's intended meaning and you see this in exegetical commentaries and even grammar sometimes, where people have their theological pet subject or whatever, and they use the grammatical categories to force a particular text into that particular theological category. And I think this is one of the dangers of doing exegesis without reading the text, is that you end up with this artificial understanding of how the text works, whereas with reading the text, it doesn't matter whether you've got an active approach or a passive approach. I think you start to see the feel and the flow of the author's thoughts and arguments, the kinds of words he's using and reusing often, which is significant and often lost in English translations. And so I think that exegesis is important. If you want to study the text, if you want to preach from it, I think you want to do exegesis. But if you're only doing exegesis, I think that there's a huge danger that you can use the exegetical categories to fit your own theological background, opinions, preconceptions, and you're actually not doing good exegesis at that point, because your knowledge of the language is letting you down. That would be my response to that. You want to add anything to that, Kevin?
I think that's a great point. You just see this all the time. I read commentaries and I'm like, you got so focused on this one word that you forgot about all the other words around you, and it's a language,
Yeah.
And I think the reality is, as humans, we are extraordinary at using language, right? So our ability to read something and understand it intuitively is actually incredible, right? We do not think about the kind of I keep going back to the genitive the kind of genitive something is, right? We just don't think about that. We know how to interpret it in context, right? Intuitively. And I think that's it's so important to realize that when you go to the commentary and when you try to do exegesis yourself, you're going to be much better. You should be much better at reading than doing exegesis, right? If you are not, there's a problem, right? Because exegesis is not second nature. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone can analyze, what the precise relationships between two words are. But we as humans, we're like built for using language in a meaningful way. So my suggestion would be, like, if you're trying to quote unquote exegete a certain verse, read the whole chapter 10 times and then go back to the verse, right? And then you will actually see new things there that you didn't see before, and if you just look at the verse.
Yeah. So just to finish off this question, must it come after reading? Must exegesis always come after reading? I would say yes. I think you want to have a more natural understanding of the flow of the author's argument in his own words before you start dissecting what he's saying. I think sometimes we have grammatical categories for things that really don't even need grammatical categories. Sometimes we split hairs over things that the author had no intention of splitting hairs over. And I think that's one of the dangers. And when all we have is exegesis, then I think that's one of those risks that we have. So I think, yeah, you want to read before you do exegesis, and I think you want to read, if you can, the whole book repeatedly in the original language before you do a serious exegetical work across the whole book. Now, if you're just doing a passage, right? If say your pastors ask you to preach on, let's say, I don't know, John 14, 1 through 3 or something like that, we don't necessarily need you to go read through all of John's gospel before you do that. Yeah, that'll be helpful, I think, and you benefit from doing that, and you'll start to see how John 14 will fit. But you can get that from English to some extent as well. But I think, you still want to read through perhaps the surrounding context, at least in the original language, and not just like picking your way through Ritter's Reader's Edition, but actually with some understanding of the flow of thought, if you like, to help you as you go through that. So I think, yes, you want to do exegesis after you've done reading. And I think exegesis as a skill is probably best developed after reading as well. But again, this is where seminaries don't have that opportunity, because they've got curriculums and so on, so they speed up the process, and they just so that you end up not doing reading very well.
It's kind of like pausing a movie, halfway through and sharing about how you're feeling and analyzing what's happened so far. It's like, that's, you might find benefit in that, you might find something, but like, you've only seen half the movie. Right? Watch the whole movie and then go back and analyze it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, a couple other questions. What do we got here? Manuel Manave, I'm sorry if I screw your name up. How do you train yourself to use a particular pronunciation? Pronunciation is something that I think we have differences on. What do you use, Kevin?
Well, I mean, in Biblingo we have 4, so we know that this is an issue for people. So we have modern, Koine, Erasmian, and then like a reconstructed, like early high Koine. So I use that. That's the one used at the Polis Method or the Polis Institute with Christoph Rico. I think that if you want to get good at particular pronunciation, pick one and then just use it all the time, right? Listen to it a lot, speak it out loud a lot. You're gonna start, like, you have to develop an ear and a mouth for the pronunciation, and they go hand in hand. So I would say, listen to audio recordings and then repeat them out loud, even if you're by yourself, just all the time. And it'll sink in eventually.
Yeah, and I think this. I'm glad to hear you got lots of different pronunciation methods, because this is one of those things, people get so hung up about this, and at the end of the day, it's not that critical. Nobody's a heretic because they use Erasmian pronunciation, and no one's a heretic because they use modern pronunciation, and no one's a heretic because they use, reconstructed. So it really doesn't matter. So. I agree. There's plenty of tools now for listening to, modern or Erasmian. So there's lots of opportunities. So just take advantage of those tools and use them. Nathan. Yeah, Peter, sorry, carry on.
Just to say really quick, I also don't think it matters. But or as much as people say, but you and I, we know English fine. We don't talk the same.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And no one says that you don't know English because
Some
you
people
sound like
do,
you're...
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah. Mostly English people say I don't know English because I don't speak... Well, maybe that's American. I don't know. Anyway.
Well, they say that about me for sure.
Yeah. So Nathan Pina asks, how do we obtain the Greek mindset of expression? For example, when I try to speak Spanish, I'm essentially speaking Spanish with English with Spanish words. It confuses native speakers. Do you want to talk to that? You'll be better at talking to this than me, Kevin.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in the beginning, when you're learning a language, there is no getting around putting in your own categories, your first language categories into a second language, right? And this is just across the board. And I mentioned this, right? In even in commentaries when they say, oh, this is the definite article, it means the. That's not true. It's just like false, right? It does not. You don't have one-to-one carryover in these things between languages. So honestly, the thing you have to do is you have to have consistent feedback loop. right? So when you go out and you speak to someone in Spanish, right, and they say, "Oh, you sound like you're speaking English," you say, "Okay, why? Why is that the case? Like, what am I saying that leads you to conclude that my syntax is, English and the words are Spanish, right?" So the way that we do this with dead languages is the text. So the reality is that we do have native speaker output in Koine Greek, right? And it is written down in text, right? And those are, I mean, not everyone who wrote Greek is a native speaker, right? But some of them were. And so what we do is you practice, speaking something, right? And even in your community or even by yourself, and then you go back to the text and you say, and you read it with a conscious awareness of like, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. How do I then adjust, how I'm using the language to model this native speaker text, right? That's the idea. That's how you use a text as a learning tool to help you refine, your competence, your active competence in a dead language.
Yeah, and I would imagine here that the challenge is that you're going from English, which has got a very fixed word order, to an inflected language, and it doesn't matter if it's going to be Spanish or Greek or whatever. The same challenge is going to persist in those cases as well. Yeah. Very good. Cool. That's a great answer. Thank you. Another one here from Abaddon Nurgle. There we go. Abaddon Nurgle. Sorry. I know that Abaddon Nurgle is somebody who's popped up in my YouTube channels. They have very good questions and comments. I'm sorry if I missed you. I'm sorry for messing up your name. But Kevin, what's the value of gaining proficiency or familiarity with modern Hebrew and modern Greek?
Yeah, so I think there is not as much as people say. If you have an opportunity to learn biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew actively, modern Greek and modern Hebrew are not going to add much value. If you have an opportunity to learn it actively. So the issue is that I see people all the time, they learn modern Hebrew and they start to try to use biblical Hebrew and they're speaking modern Hebrew, right? And it's very difficult. There are very nuanced differences, and it's very difficult for most people to figure out what those differences are and use them appropriately. That being said, if you don't have the opportunity to acquire, biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew actively, this is what we're trying to do with Biblingo, right? So I would say that you do have that opportunity, but there are other people besides us doing this, right? But if you don't have that opportunity, then the benefit of learning the modern languages is especially in developing fluency for morphology. So for what I mean by fluency is you don't have to think about the constructions that you're using, right? So most people that aren't fluent in a language, what they have to do is they have to think like, okay, adelphe. What's the genitive of adelphe? Adelphes, right? And they have to think about that instead of just being able to use that in a way, in context, in the appropriate way. You can just say haptomaites adelphes, right? And that is where learning the modern languages has the potential to help you with that kind of fluency, right? Because there are so many more ways to practice, right? You can speak with native speakers, and you can just develop that sort of automatic intuition and conjugation of the forms. But that, I think, is becoming less and less important as more and more resources come out that help you to build proficiency in the biblical languages.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And the difference between, say, modern Greek and Koine would be different to the difference between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew, right?
Yes, but really,
at least from a syntactical point of view.
Right. So I'm someone who I don't know modern Greek, right? So I can't say a ton about it. I can tell you, I have talked to a particular linguistics professor who's from Greece, modern Greek speaker, native, right? I asked her, how do you feel about reading the New Testament, right? And she said, oh, the New Testament's easy, right? She said, New Testament is very easy. There's a bigger difference to her between, Plato or the classic stuff and the New Testament than between the New Testament and modern Greek, right? So for her, and I think that historically, right, this makes sense that Koine, became the common dialect, and when that happened, it did simplify things, and it became more frozen, right? We should say more, right? It obviously has developed and changed, but that's just her perspective, right? That she finds no problem going to New Testament to read from modern Greek. She definitely has a problem with going with classical stuff, right? Especially as far back as Homer. Hebrew is different in the sense that it was revived very recently. But there are particular verb forms that have completely dropped out of modern Hebrew. There are certain constructions that are very different. I think most people's perception is that it's very similar, and if you take a certain strand of the language, it is quite similar. But I would say Hebrew is also changing rapidly. If you go to Israel today and you speak to a 5-year-old, they're going to talk differently than a 35-year-old. It is enough to where, I mean, it's becoming less and less helpful, as I said, to learn the modern languages.
Right. Yeah, no, that's good. That's really helpful, I think, as well, because, when I was in seminary, one of my Hebrew professors said that, modern Hebrew is much more accessible, and part of the reason for that was it's much more recently what do you call it? I should have had a drink of water.
Revived.
There we go. That's the word. Thank you. Yeah. So that's good to know. So interesting. I hadn't sort of seen that more recent kind of element of it. So I appreciate that. So there's a couple more questions here. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them, but there is one here that I did want to get to, and this is from Stephen. Does the natural language approach look at text from a big picture view, and if so, is it more naturally compatible with discourse analysis? And this is, I guess, where we want to get into a discussion of functional linguistics, given that we've got 3 minutes before our time is kind of up. But I did want to just see what you think of this question anyways, and then we'll wrap up from here.
So people do discourse analysis in a lot of different ways, right? So just preface this answer with that. I will say that the natural language method, or the communicative approach, it helps you to internalize the grammar, which helps you to read faster, right? That's the goal, is for you to be able to read like it's English. So you will be better at analyzing a full paragraph if you can read it faster. If you're going word by word and you're looking up every other word in the dictionary, right? You can't do discourse analysis well if that's your proficiency level, because you lose track of what you read, the previous sentence. Nonetheless, the previous paragraph, right? Which is what you need to do like good discourse analysis. So I would say whatever you do, you need to read quickly and fluently.
Yeah, good answer. Yeah. And I think, like you said, discourse analysis, and, this is one of those areas. I think there's still a lot of work needs to be done here. There's a lot of good work that's being done, which is great. And I'm sort of thinking more from somebody within the biblical studies camp rather than in the linguistics camp. But I think, more work needs to be done here to make, because this is really a branch of linguistics, and to bring it into biblical studies. And I think we're at an early stage with this at the moment, and I'd like to see more done in this area. So I know we've got at least one member in Master New Testament Greek who is currently doing a PhD in linguistics, particularly around discourse analysis. So those are the kinds of things that, I'm sure the output of those kinds of studies will be really helpful for us long term. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Kevin, for taking the time to answer some of these questions with us. This has been fantastic. It's been a lot of fun just sort of talking. It's been surprising too. I think there's there's a lot more in common even than what I thought. Just as we got onto the call earlier on, I thought, man, I'm sure there'd be some things in common. I'm sure there'd be a lot of differences, but there's actually more I think we have in common, even just from this discussion anyway, than I sort of anticipated, which is fantastic. And I really appreciate that. So thank you, Kevin, for taking the time to spend with us today. For those of you who are still on the live call, there's still nearly 50 people. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the like button. I encourage you to go and check out Biblingo. What's the website, Kevin?
Biblingo.org.
Biblingo.org. And if you're interested in learning more from my point of view, then I have a roadmap you can download at Master New Testament Greek, masterntgreek.com/roadmap, and you can download that there as well. But again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll look forward to, well, maybe we'll do this again, but we'll look forward to catching up again in the future, and I certainly look forward to sharing more about Master New Testament Greek with you on this channel in the future as well. So thanks very much.
Sounds great.